Have you ever struggled to figure out where each instrument belongs in your mix? Like, where should I pan my hi-hats? Or how loud should my snare drum be? Well, in this video, I'm gonna show you one simple chart that will make mixing instruments 10 times easier. It'll solve all of those questions I just asked, and it will also introduce an important mixing concept that really opened up my mixes when I started using it. On top of all of that, this chart I'll show is one of my favorite ways to visualize the complex art of audio mixing, which will absolutely help in you making better music. Let's hop in. Here's what the chart looks like. Please forgive the awful 3D skills I have. I tried my best. I know it seems a little complicated, but once I explain each part, it's gonna make a whole lot more sense. Each axis of this graph represents an important part of the mixing process, and depending on which way you view it, you'll be able to see a general guide for each of the instruments and how you should mix them in your mix. I'll explain each part of this graph one at a time so you can really understand it. I'll start with the easier concepts, and then I'll save the most important concept you need to know for last. After each concept, I'll use the graph to help me mix a real life song that I've recorded so you can see and hear how to use this graph in real time to help for your mixes. I'm telling you, the concepts in this graph really changed the way I thought about my mix for the better. Let's start off with the first part of the graph that's important to know about. Pillar number one of the audio mixing temple, the stereo spectrum. More importantly, panning. Panning is when you move an instrument away from the middle of the sound spectrum and place it to be louder on either the left side or the right side. Panning helps create the illusion of width, and it helps put sounds in a more realistic sound space. It's pretty importante for making music. For some instruments, it's recommended to keep them more focused in the center of the mix. For others, it's better to spread out the width to give the song more depth. Let's hop back into that graph to see what I'd recommend doing for each instrument. If you look at the graph, you can see that these bottom numbers are how we're going to represent panning, with minus 64 being all the way panned left and plus 64 being all the way panned right. Some DAWs have minus 100 and plus 100, but I use Logic, which uses a MIDI system of 128, so minus 64 and plus 64. And if you look at this key here, you can see what each instrument color is represented by. In the middle, we have our main vocals. And then as you go out wider, we have this green box here, which is kind of this piano. We have our synths, which are way in the back here, and you can see them kind of pan a little bit farther left. But then you can see our background vocals, I like to pan hard left and hard right. This is a concept called doubling, and it often happens if you want to add some more stereo width to your song. As you can see, the lead is completely down the middle, but oftentimes background voices will either be hard pan left or hard pan right. Normally, the things you pan down the middle will be the more prominent parts of your song. For example, in this case, my lead vocal, my snare drum, and my kick drum are all panned in the middle. You can see my bass is a little bit more spread out. Occasionally, basses can be a lot wider than this, but this is a general guideline that I like to follow. This will get you started in the right direction if you don't know anything about panning or mixing. Anytime you pan something left or right, it will be less noticeable than if things that are panned down the middle. If you ever forget, just think about somebody talking to you in real life. Are you gonna be focusing on the person that's directly in front of you, speaking to both ears? Or are you gonna be focusing on the person that's 10 feet away, talking in your left ear? There you go. Another concept that you might notice is these boxes have doubles on each side. That usually means that I'm double tracking them to pan one hard left and one hard right to give it even more stereo width. Oftentimes these will be the exact same part, but double tracking them, recording them 2 separate times, and then panning one take left and one take right will give you a really wide sounding track. Occasionally, these other elements will take the place of the lead vocal. For example, this green box here represents a synth, but if I have a lead synth that will take over the vocal part, I might put it right up in front here. If you're liking the video so far and learning some audio nuggets, go and hit that like button right down below. Thanks, pal. Let's see how we can use panning in our song now. If we open up our mixer, we can see all of our tracks are panned dead center. You can tell by this knob right here. But right now we have everything pretty much panned hard in the middle, but there are some things I want to get away from the center. If we go back to our graph here, you'll see that these hi-hats are not exactly in the middle. I like to put my hi-hats a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. I know the colors don't exactly match to kind of blend in with each other, but trust me, those are hi-hats. I'm gonna take my hi-hats and just move them ever so slightly to the left. We're driving different roads now. I think that we both. Nice. The bass, the kick, and the snare are all dead center. Perfect. I also want my lead vocal to be dead center. Notice that when I play these background vocals though, if they are completely dead center, they take a little bit away from the main. So I'm gonna go into these background vocals and I'm going to pan them hard left and hard right, just like I had here. In this box here on the left and this box here on the right. All right, let's go back in and we'll go from there. So I'm gonna take one of these hard left, hard right, and then I actually recorded 3, so I'm just going to keep this one in the middle as well, but I'm going to turn the volume down on all of these. I'll be talking more about that later. We have this part now coming in. This is panned dead middle. Sometimes instead of using the pan knob, I'll actually add in a effect like a chorus, which will pan it out of the middle and just to get it out of the way even more. So let's just hear what this sounds like now. There we go. We're already getting it on the sides. Okay, let's do the same thing for this piano here. If we look at our chart, you can see that the piano is a little bit out of the middle. Sometimes we can't do that with the pan knob, but we can do it with a different thing like a chorus or a stereo spreader. Just ever so slightly get out of the middle. Doesn't have to be a lot. If we add too much, it's gonna sound a little bit weird. I actually have 2 of the same parts here, and this is supposed to be replicating a rhythmic guitar. This is just a MIDI omnisphere playing, but if you look at my guitar stack here, this is the blue one. It's light blue here, but it's dark blue on this square. You'll notice that I usually like to keep them pretty wide. What I've done is I've recorded 2 MIDI tracks, and I'm going to pan one hard left and hard right, just like I did with my background voices. This is gonna really spread it out. Check it out. There we go. Cool. So now I have these 2 MIDI notes spread out. And after moving those last background voices right here, let's check out what it sounds like. If I want black shell, painted white. Next up in building the mixing temple, we've got frequencies. The popular kid at the mixing party. I actually don't think it's as important as the last tip that I'll share, but it is still absolutely vital for good sounding music. Frequencies are the vibrations of sound waves in hertz. Low frequencies are bassier and sound lower. High frequencies have more treble and sound higher. A good mix will try to find a pocket of space for each instrument to sit in so it can best be heard. For example, if you have a kick drum and a bass drum both taking up the very low frequencies, it's going to muddy your mix. Each instrument's pocket generally follows a similar pattern, which we can see right here that I've made in this graph. Wow. So if we go right back down to the middle, we can see our panning is still there. But if you look on the left-hand side here, you can see these numbers from 20 kilohertz all the way down to 50 kilohertz. Normally, this is on a logarithmic scale, so they're not evenly spaced like they are here, but my 3D skills are not very good. So just bear with me in this case. I have given some lined boxes so you can kind of tell a little bit better. And also notice that around 50 hertz, you're really not gonna have anything except other than this bass and kick. Most of the other things are correct. But for example, the vocals, you won't really need to go below 100 hertz. You can cut all that out. I just didn't make the boxes quite correctly. Another thing that I want to point out, in these hertz, you can see the different items. You can see that this kick drum should be the lowest thing that we have here. And the kick drum will stop around 3K. It'll go up a little bit higher, but that's where it should be focused. The bass should be around the same. Usually the kick is a little bit lower than the bass, which I've noted here. The bass starts around 50 hertz and around that 3K mark, once again, should be dying down a little bit. It's really going to be focused in this real low mid frequencies. Then if you look at the snare, it doesn't start till around 150 hertz, but it can go all the way up to 10,000 hertz. And that's just exactly what happens with actual snare drums. These are acoustic guitars as what I've done here. Notice that the vocals take up the entire frequency spectrum. That is very true and very typical of vocals. We have evolved our ears to go alongside a human voice, so that's why we can hear the entirety of it. Another thing I want to point out is that it's okay to have overlapping frequencies. Notice that my vocal is going to take up all the space. That doesn't mean that everything else should be cut out at that spot. If that happened, then I would have no other instruments to go for. These instruments, as they overlap with these boxes, are going to share the frequency spectrum, and that's okay. It's just about balancing them to make sure that they fit into their respective pockets and where their energy is focused most. Balancing all of these frequencies is a really key part of mixing. Now that I've explained a little bit more about this graph and the frequencies, let's go into our mix and see how we can affect the frequencies to make the mix even better. So, like I said, a really common thing for me to do when it comes to frequencies is cut out that low end. It doesn't show it as well in the graph, but just trust me on this. The only things you really want in that low end are going to be your kick and your snare. And everything else, you can honestly just high pass or low cut and get rid of that low end. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to clean up that low end ever so slightly. For example, my hi-hats absolutely don't need any information down here. You can see there's a little bit of 200 hertz coming. Let's just get rid of that. What about my claps? Same. Let's play my snare drum so we don't cut out too much of that bottom end. But you can see, look at this. We don't need that. All right, now that we've cut out those from our things, let's cut out these from our other instruments. To make things easier, I'm actually just going to bus all of these in one single bus to make them kind of my synths, pianos, and type bus synths. And we're going to put an EQ over all of them so that we can do this all at one time. It sounds like that this particular one right here has a lot of low end in it. It's just FX to make it sound more like a real guitar. But that kind of punchiness right there is taking away from the bass. So I'm just using this and cutting it out ever so slightly to make that bass and that kick shine through. Cool, let's see how my bass and kick specifically are getting along together. I think they're working together pretty nicely, and that's all because we can kind of use that EQ to fit things into the pocket. We can continue going through the rest of our song and placing things into the pocket that they belong into. But as we reference our graph again, we can kind of see where everything is sitting from a frequency standpoint. We have more things happening the higher we go up. Usually the biggest part of the frequency spectrum that we'll be working with as we're mixing is kind of in this mid-range here between like 100 and 1,000 hertz. I'd say that's where a lot of the fundamental frequencies of sounds exist, or in other words, their biggest sound bump. If I take a look at a sound, I can show you what that sounds like more. For example, if I go into this piano here, the fundamental frequencies are these lower ones that the actual notes are happening on, and then the higher frequencies are all called harmonics. You'll find that it's easier to mix harmonics at the higher end of the frequency because the waveforms are closer together and they move faster. In the low end, it's more important to get right and cut out those basses like I did with the frequency because they're really big waveforms and not all of them can coexist together with it sounding muddy. So even just doing a few things with EQ, you can already hear that our sounds are working together really well. Keep in mind that our sounds are already curated to sound good together. The mixing and the EQ is secondary to choosing the best sounds possible and getting good recordings. Keep that in mind. Let's hear where we're at after doing a little bit more with EQ. If I want black she'll paint it white, and if I turn left then she'll stay right. And finally, the last part of the graph we'll cover is something I really don't hear about a lot in mixing: distance. And it actually goes hand in hand with the most important part of mixing: volume. Let me explain. When I say the distance of a track, I'm talking about how close or far the track is perceived from the listener. You can affect distance with two variables specifically: reverb and volume. In real life, if someone was standing far away in a room, when they speak, you'll also hear all of the echoes of that room around you. On the other hand, if someone was speaking directly in your face, you'd probably hear no reverb at all. With that in mind, as you begin to add a reverb to your track, you'll slowly push it farther backwards in the mix and farther away from your listener. Similarly, as you make your tracks more dry, the more you'll push it forward in the mix. I normally like to keep some things fairly dry and up front, while others I like to keep farther back. And if we take a look here, you can see here that I like my lead vocals more up front than my guitars, for example, which are in blue. You can also change the distance of these tracks. Generally, as I'm working, the near things will be completely dry, whereas the far things will be a little bit more reverb. Moving backwards, the things will tend to get more reverby and farther back in the mix. There's also another way that you can make things farther back in the mix, and it's volume. Mixing with volume is actually the fundamental part of mixing itself, and I would argue the most important. Louder sounds will sound closer, quieter sounds will sound farther. Think of the person in the room, it's exactly the same. So let's dive into the graph. I'll show you a little bit about what I was thinking, and then we'll hop into the real mix and I'll show you. Looking once again at this graph here, you can see that I've chosen some things to be more upfront. For example, the things that should be closest to the listener are your lead vocal. Of course, that should be the loudest thing. It's the most important. Your snare drum should be second in volume. And then third should be your kick. And you can see your kind of kick box right here coming in. Fourth, I like to have my bass the next loudest, and then everything else kind of fits in between. These background vocals depends on where you want them to be, but they can range anywhere from like being really front to being really far back, depending on how much reverb you put on them, etc. Generally, I like to keep my hi-hats farther back than my bass and my snare and my kick and my lead. But this is just a way of visualizing where in the sound spectrum, how much volume each thing should have specifically and how much reverb it should have. If I am going to put some reverb on it, notice that a lot of these reverb things also are panned hard left and hard right. This is thinking about my mix in 3 dimensions. If something is all the way panned left and it has a lot of reverb on it, it's going to be much farther away in the stereo mix than it would be from my lead vocals, say for example, which are dry and completely down the middle. This is just another way of thinking about how you want to place all of your instruments, and hopefully you can use this 3D chart as a guide. I know it's not perfect, but there you go. And now that we have volume and distance, including reverb, let's hop back into our mix and use those to fine tune some things and finish out our song. So first of all, for these background voices, I know I'm gonna want to add some reverb. I actually have a reverb bus here, so I'm just gonna add this up really high. I'm also gonna turn these down quite a bit. Cool, my lead voice is sounding pretty good, but it's also sounding a bit loud, I think. It should be the main part of your mix, but that's fine. A helpful tip that you can use to make sure that those mixing volumes are right is to turn your sound down a ton. So let me take the stereo out bus so you can hear it too. And you should be hearing that kick drum, that snare drum, and that voice more than anything. I'm really liking this synth pad, but I think it should be farther in the background. So I'm gonna add some reverb to put it back there, and I'm also gonna turn it down ever so slightly. Let's hear what it sounds like now. Also like these acoustic things, but they're a little bit too dry for me. I'm gonna put some reverb on it once again. Same reverb bus, just doing this really quickly. This is a quick and dirty rendition of this last part of the graph, which is arguably the most important, but I just want to give you an idea of how I'm thinking about things as I'm adding reverb, moving volume around, and thinking about their relationship with everything else in the mix. So after using this chart to help guide some mixing decisions, I've completed this mix at least for this tutorial, and I want to show you what it sounds like before and after using this 3D graph that I've been explaining. Check it out from the verse. If I want to, you don't. We're driving different roads now. I think that we both know. If I want black shell painted white, and if I turn left, then she'll stay right. I still love her through the panels, even though they won't change. If I wanna go, then she'll wanna stay. In my opinion, a whole lot better. There you go. So that'll do it. Mixing explained visually with a poorly made 3D graph. I'm a producer, not a Blender artist. But just by visualing what's happening, it's gonna help make your mixing 10 times easier. I've included a link in the description to my website so you can reference this 3D mixing graph that I made whenever you want. Take it with a grain of salt, but use it to help guide your decisions. As always, subscribe for more music production videos like this that will share things like this 3D graph that I haven't seen anywhere else. Happy mixing.